actually is not high school graduation. It's beginning a lot earlier than that. As those of you who are doing child psychology know, the time when children could relax and be children and fall off their bikes and fail has faded into the dim and distant past. Achievement is a spark moment of birth, if not before. William Cohen in the New York Times says now possibly tolerate is for little Freddie to be a failure, or to find out that he has an inadequate little left arm, and he's just going to have to live with it for the rest of his life. But actually that perspective is still more than a Sabbath day football game. The Army, the United States Army, were hosting a team. I hadn't a clue really what was going on, but I stayed there because I liked the girl who had taken me. Still do. She's my wife. I believe she still likes me as well. I trust so. But I was struck by the uniqueness of the game and these cheerleaders. As a teenager, you would expect me to be struck by the teenagers, but it wasn't how they looked, it was what they said. And they must have said more than this, but they definitely had this as their central cheer. And it went like this: you can do it, you can do it, you can, you can. You can do it, you can do it, you can, you can. The fundamental problem was they couldn't. Because they were annihilated by the army. The army thrashed them. And I remember the score becoming so unbelievable. I'm used to football played with your feet, and the score is relatively minor, but they were like a 37 thick. You can, you can. Somebody should have had the courage to say, stop that. Well, that's enough on the culture. Let's change gears once again. And ask the question, where then does the contemporary church fall in relationship to these things? If there is any sense of accuracy in what we're suggesting from the biblical model here as it relates to Paul, and if one's generalizations from the culture hold any water, then would it be fair to say that the church is firmly grounded in its understanding of inadequacy as a foundation for usefulness? Seminarian is about to launch himself or herself on an unsuspecting church and let them all know how brilliant she is, or how terrific he is, and how they just can't wait to discover it. Now, I'm going to spend less time on this purposefully. I'm also going to put my sentences in the interrogative rather than in the declarative. I am also not going to give specific examples with people's names, and therefore I run the risk of falling down in a morass of generalizations. Having said all of that, by way of disclaimer, let me play my hand. You will recall that when Nehemiah was assigned the task for the rebuilding of the walls and the rehanging of the gates in the broken down context of Jerusalem, the first thing that he did was pray. Then he did a reconnaissance. And after his reconnaissance, under cover of night and with little fuss and bother, he didn't arrive in Jerusalem under a great banner saying, "Your greatest fears are over, I am here, Nehemiah has arrived." No, he finally got the people together and he said to them, "You see the trouble we're in?" Or in the King James Version, it puts it in the interrogative, "Do you see the trouble we are in?" Well, the fact of the matter was they saw it, but they didn't see it. They had grown accustomed to the trouble that they were in. They had begun to live with it. It was so familiar to them that it took somebody coming from the outside to let them see that the real predicament was not actually in the fact that the walls were broken down, but the broken down walls were a metaphor for the fact that the glory of God was being dragged in the dust of a Judean hillside. And so his prophetic role is to call the people in the midst of the situation to stand back far enough from it for a moment and to view it from the perspective of God, and then to determine what needs to be done from there. And so it is that in every generation the role of the prophet is in part to say, do you see this? Do you see the way in which our pulpits increasingly sound like popular therapy rather than unpopular theology? Are we aware how little the call of the kingdom rings out? He who would be a narcissistic culture that is intensely interested in feeling good about itself is so different from Christ's. He is the one who calls for the renunciation of the self. You want to save your life, then lose it. If you lose your life for my sake and the gospel, says Jesus, you will find it. It is in loss that you find it. In trying to hold on to it, you lose it. That we are now embarrassed by any notion, the last and the left out in our communities, into generalization, and I understand that. But nevertheless, part of the answer may lie in the fact that we portray ourselves as the company that has it all together, as the company that understands everything, that has got it all buttoned down. And so the person says, well, I daren't go in there. Pictures. Makes it hard for an old cracked pot to nuzzle in amongst all that shiny stuff. Is it possible that our churches are more akin to Lake Wobegon, the little town that time forgot and the decades cannot improve, where all the women are strong? I'm just asking you to think, that's all. Smugness. Evangelical smugness. Such a smugness, such a pervasive smugness, that the smug don't know how smug they are. It will take, and by David Wells, that quotes efforts to build character, times that we don't realize where we are. What is the chief end of man? The chief end of man is to glorify God. To glorify God. Not to glorify myself. To glorify God. Paul says, if I want to glorify myself, I can run through my credentials any day you want. I went to the right schools. I came from the right family background. I had everything by the tail. But I'm not here to do that. That's why I would all the more gladly glory in my infirmities and in my insufficiencies, in order that the transcendent power might be seen to belong to God. You can't have it both ways. You cannot from the pulpit, if I may just illustrate it from you for a moment, you cannot from the pulpit make people believe that you're fantastic and that Jesus is fantastic simultaneously. No, they may look at you and say, you mean a little pipsqueak like that was able to expound that passage? That's amazing. We must have a great God and a great Bible. Is it conceivable that we suffer from humility in the wrong place? Humility in the wrong place. Do you remember how Chesterton on one occasion observed that a man was meant to be doubtful of himself, but undoubting about the truth? Doubtful of himself, undoubting about the truth. This has now been exactly reversed. We are producing a crop of preachers who are very sure about themselves and creatively vague about doctrinal orthodoxy. So they're very, very sure about who they are. And they believe that it is the great apologetic to let the world know that they are equally unsure about just everything between the covers of their Bible. It's humility in the wrong place. I think on that occasion Chesterton said, we are now breeding a group of individuals who are too humble to acknowledge the validity of the 3 times table. In a strange leap to Ronald Reagan, if you've ever gone to the Reagan Library in Simi Valley and put on the earphones and gone into the mock-up of the Oval Office, you will have heard President Reagan's voice in your ears. And like me, you will have been intrigued by much that is said. And like me, you may have been arrested when he reaches the point and he says, I never regarded this as my own office. That I never removed my suit coat when I was working in the Oval Office. And then there's a pause. And he says, you see, you can take the office seriously without taking yourself too seriously. Is it possible that contemporary evangelicalism is increasingly fertilized by those of us who take ourselves too seriously while not taking that to which we've been called seriously enough? That brings me then to my final point, as the uncomfortable nature of the challenge turns its gaze on us as individuals. If we consider it in terms of the biblical pattern, and then in terms of the cultural context, and then in terms of, if you like, the ecclesiastical framework, then now what about it personally? It's the challenge to ask ourselves whether we're prepared to face up to our impotence, or are we going to kid ourselves? Are we going to start to believe our own press clippings? Are we going to start to be imbibing some of this elixir that makes it very difficult for your wife to sleep with you in the evening because she can't find a pillow big enough to accommodate your gargantuan cranium, like a grapefruit on a toothpick? Says C.S. Lewis in The Four Loves, those like myself, whose imagination far exceeds their obedience, are subject to a just penalty. We easily imagine conditions far higher than we have actually reached. If we describe what we have imagined, we may make others and make ourselves believe that we have really been there, and so fool both them and ourselves. You see, here is one of the arenas in which we face the danger of allowing the world to squeeze us into its own mold. Many times when we expound Romans chapter 12, 1 and 2, it has more of a flavor to it of dealing with some of the bits and pieces, and often in a teenager's life. I remember I listened to so many sermons on that. It was all about a sort of second level of Christianity, and if you wanted to be a missionary, you had to be a Romans 12, 1 and 2 Christian. But if you just wanted to be a Christian, you didn't really have to worry about it very, very much. I hope we're all saved from that. But what is striking to me is that after he says, this is your service of reasonable worship, what is the very first point of application? Do not think of yourself more highly than you ought. He starts right there with humility. You offer your body as a living sacrifice to God, your mind, your influence, all that you have, all of your training, all of your studies, all of your everything. You offer it all up to God, which is your reasonable service of spiritual worship. Then immediately he says, now listen, don't think of yourself more highly than you ought, but rather with sober judgment. Let's think about pastors just for a moment. Let's turn the gaze where it's most uncomfortable, the searchlight that shines right in my eyes that I cannot avoid. As pastors and church leaders, we have to ask ourselves whether we can honestly say with Paul, we do not preach ourselves. 2 Corinthians 4:5. We do not preach ourselves, but sake. Can we really say we do not preach ourselves? Let me tell you, we preach ourselves when we seek to advance our reputation, our influence, and our own well-being. We preach ourselves when our pulpits become the occasion of conjecture and personal opinion rather than the exposition of the text. We preach ourselves when we intrude continually with stories about ourselves or attempts to display our cleverness. The commentator Barnes puts it simply when he says, we preach ourselves in one word when self is primary and the gospel is secondary. When we prostitute the ministry to gain popularity, to live a life of ease, to be respected, to gain influence, to rule over the world. So we need to pray, don't we? That God in His mercy will do whatever it takes in order to drive home to our hearts the reality of our insufficiency. Until we know, not just intellectually, but experientially, that Jesus meant what he said when he told his followers, apart from me, you can do nothing. We're in real difficulty. Sir Malcolm Sargent, the fellow who's responsible for creating the tedium at high school graduations, when a half-baked orchestra plays ad nauseum, dum dum da da dum dum dum. That's Sargent. We have him to thank for that. On one occasion, he's listening to a very fine singer. The girl is a soprano. She is singing an operatic piece. She is apparently flawless in her technique. Of her tone is exceptional. She finished. So what do you think? Her heart. To break her heart. You see, fellas, girls, what Paul is displaying here is a reliance on Christ alone for life and power. To rely on Christ for life and for power demands that I seek to rely upon myself, that I renounce my confidence in any of my own wisdom and my own willpower, and I turn entirely to Christ, asking Him for the wisdom and power that is needed. You can do the research on your own now. We started in Corinthians with Paul. We might easily have gone to the psalmist. Psalm 127. Unless the Lord builds the house, the builders labor in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the watchman stands guard in vain. In other words, we build and we watch in vain apart from the Lord. Solomon, God, ask him for this insight. Can you help me? Say, you've come to the right man. Boy, if there's away from that. I cannot, but God can. Or what about the leadership of Jehoshaphat when he assembles all the people together in the square and somebody comes and says, there's a vast army coming against you, it will annihilate us. He called out to God. Oh God, he says, we do not know what to do, but our eyes are upon you. We have no power to face this vast army coming against us. Do you find that in any leadership books lately? Wall Street today has a number of principles of how you're supposed to be a successful leader. I guarantee you this isn't one of them. The one thing you don't do is stand up in front of the congregation and say, I don't know what to do. We're completely overwhelmed. That's Jehoshaphat. Because God, Isaiah 40. There you are. Trinity graduate. Take that big diploma, put it up on the wall, and have your wife or your friend or somebody just draw a picture of an old, or just as much jars of an unworthy servant of my friend and master Jesus Christ, a sinner saved by grace to the glory, in a continual and irreconcilable war.